Weirding Way Media.
Welcome to episode 122 of the Filmmaking podcast. I'm Jamie Benning and I'm your host for the next hour or so. I hope you're doing well. My life always seems to ramp up around March after a fairly quiet winter period work-wise. It's about to get busy again, and that's a good thing because, yes, my bank account is looking pretty sparse at the moment. Thanks for your continued support on Patreon, patreon.com/Jamie Benning. All 112 of you that support the podcast are very much the reason that I'm still doing this. And my hopes of doubling that number this time last year have not worked out, but I'm not going anywhere. And I've got lots of guest interviews in the bag during my quiet period and many more lined up in the coming months. What else has been going on? Oh yeah, I've recently revamped filmumentaries.com to give it more of a kind of cohesive look. I'm still working on several pages on the site, but the new banner is done. And I think it just helps to bring the whole thing into a bit of a slicker look. I'm also working on a book pitch with a friend about a guest, actually, that was on this podcast. It's only in the very early stages. We're yet to get his agreement on the project, but it's exciting to have something new on the horizon. And we're also working on another idea of creating a book of some of my interviews that I've done for this podcast. Text versions, extended versions. I've also just arranged with my co-director on the Joe Alves doc to shoot at some locations where a certain film was shot back in 1974. So lots going on. Not enough money to do them, but hey, you only live once. You know, it's worth doing these things. Tonight I'm going up to the BFI to see Kermode in 3D again. For those of you who don't know who Mark Kermode is, he's a film reviewer over here in the UK, has a big film podcast, Kermode and Mayo's Take, and Kermode in 3D is the thing he does at the BFI, so he's there, he's got guests, and this is their 100th episode, and it should be a fun celebration, and I've even wangled my way into the after party, thanks to a kind friend's connections, so looking forward to that tonight. Okay, anyway, on this episode, I'm talking to Howard Berry, filmmaker, editor, lecturer, and the driving force behind a new documentary that I supported proudly called Her Name Was Moviola. The film focuses on the lost art of editing on a moviola, featuring none other than friend of the podcast, and he's going to be a guest again very soon. His book's coming out in April, Walter Murch, the legendary editor behind Apocalypse Now, The English Patient, and, you know, sound designer, all-round film intellectual. Howard explains how the project came about in our conversation about tracking down vintage film editing equipment to securing rare numbering tape from the least likely place to persuading Mike Leigh to provide rushes from his film Mr. Turner for the documentary. So the documentary, Her Name Was Moviola, is about the importance of the moviola really in the film industry, and it really gave me a really sort of in-depth insight into what it used to take to edit a movie. I've always had an appreciation for editors, but my goodness, when you see what goes into it, if you're not involved in the industry, it's quite surprising really just how kind of hands-on and nuts and bolts it is. And we discussed, how editing on a moviola is very physical, it's a hands-on craft, and preserving that knowledge and that history matters. You know, if you're interested in those nuts and bolts of filmmaking, this is a great one. Okay, so here's my conversation with filmmaker Howard Berry, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on. Howard, thanks for joining me today. It's great to have you here. I think our paths have crossed in different ways online for many, many years now, and it's nice to finally talk to you. And we're talking about your new film, Her name was Moviola. How did the project come about? Walter Murch is involved, Mike Lee's involved. How did it start and how did it grow from there?
It all started with my oral history of Elstree Studios called the Elstree Project.
Yeah.
And I began that in 2009 as a Stanley Kubrick project, doing oral history with his family and his collaborators. And through that, I was introduced to several crew members who'd worked at Elstree. And I thought it would be a really nice idea to carry on doing interviews with other people who worked at Elstree, not just on Kubrick related projects.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was 2009 and 2010 that began. And Walter was one of the people that I knew of, never had met. I'd heard him speak before, because my background was in picture editing. I worked as a visual effects editor, and I was working now as a lecturer at the University of Hertfordshire, where I set this project up. And I thought, well, he's in San Francisco or somewhere. I had that kind of idea that he was somewhere off in the Bay Area. And so through the Kubrick connection, I managed to secure an interview with Steven Spielberg. He hadn't quite twigged how close Jan Harlan, Stanley's brother-in-law and producer, was still with Kubrick, knowing that he'd exec produced AI with him.
Mm-hmm.
But that was such a long time ago, and I thought, with films, people move on, and Spielberg makes about 18 films a year. So, I was kind of thinking, it never really occurred to me that there was still a strong connection, but there was. And so I was at Jan's house one day, and I noticed that he had an invite to the premiere of Warhorse. And so I said, "Oh, is that due to you knowing Steven Spielberg?" And he goes, "Oh, yes, yes, yeah. He's a nice man." And I thought, okay, yeah, like one of the most famous filmmaker on the planet.
Yeah.
So this little seed was in there somewhere. And so I said, a few months later, I think he'd been nominated for a BAFTA, 4 BAFTAs for Lincoln. And so I said to Jan, I was at his house again, and I said, "Do you know if he's going to come over to the UK for the BAFTA Awards?" Because I thought that might be an opportunity for me to worm my way in
Mm-hmm.
somehow and say, could I get an interview? And before I knew it, Jan had picked up the phone and was dialing, and I thought, oh, did I say something I shouldn't have? And he's now changing the subject or whatever. And he picked up the phone to Amblin and asked if Stephen was going to be in London. And I'm just sitting there kind of like, oh, did I do that? Whoops. And anyway, the answer was no, he's busy. And I thought, fine, if he's not coming to me, I will go to him.
Mm-hmm.
So in November that year, this is 2013, I was with Jan again, and he said, "Oh, you were asking about Stephen. I think you should go and meet him." And I said, "Oh, yes, please." So next thing, he sends an email, and I get an invitation to go to California, which is just really bizarre.
Mm-hmm.
So Jan said, "We must make it worth your while whilst you're going." I was like, "Do you not think you've already made it worth my while? Come on!" Like he said, "No, no, we must find you more people." So we ended up with me also. Jan arranged for me to meet with Joe Turkel
Mm.
as well, and I thought, well, Los Angeles and San Francisco aren't that far away. I mean, considering the distance I'm already traveling, let's see if I can just push it a little bit further. So I reached out to Lee Unkrich,
Mm.
who I'd been friends with for about 3 years by that point through Twitter. We'd met in person. I'd gone to Pixar and given him a whole load of interviews about The
Mm-hmm.
Shining in 2012. And I said to Lee, "I don't suppose you know Walter Murch, do you?" And he wrote back and said, "No, but one of my assistants worked with him as an assistant on a previous film, Robert Graham Jones. I'll introduce you." And I think within an hour, I had an email from Walter saying, "Hello, Howard. I understand you want to talk to me. What can I do for you?" So, so Walter and I met. I ended up going to his house in 2013 with 5 students,
Mm-hmm.
who were filming these interviews with me. So he has a house in Bolinas, which is
Right.
over the Golden Gate Bridge,
Right.
and instead of going up to the Redwoods and Lucas Ranch and all of that, you go left and you go round the kind of coast road,
Right.
and he lives in this beautiful farmhouse, Blackberry Farm,
Mm.
in Bolinas, which is on the beach, and that's where we went. He'd spent 6 months in Vancouver editing Tomorrowland for Brad
Oh yeah.
Bird,
Hmm.
and it was his first day back. He'd arrived the night before, and it was his first morning of holiday. The 23rd of December it was, and I turned up an hour early because our taxi driver was insane and thought that he was in a racing car.
Oh gosh.
So we arrived an hour early, and Aggie, Walter's wife, ran out of the house and said, "You're horribly early. Go away." And she saw then this kind of pleading look on my face, just as if I was, I was so sorry, but
Mm.
there was nothing I could do. This mad taxi driver had literally gone 100 miles an hour around the coast. We were holding onto the side of the taxi because we were leaning right off the edge of cliffs. But she took pity on us and didn't turn us away and let me in, and we set up. And Walter came down after having had his breakfast, and so that's how we first met.
Wow.
And we had a great interview talking largely about Return to Oz, which is a film I adore,
Hmm.
which Walter directed at Elstree. And it was in 2020, it's leaping forward quite a lot now. Walter and I are still in touch. I did a screening of Return to Oz at Elstree Studios for
Hmm.
him, and we gathered some of the crew for that. And we'd spoken many times on many other things. I have now a cutting room at my university is named after Walter. We got him an honorary degree. And so, he and I have become friends.
Mm.
And he was now working in London in his other home in Primrose Hill. And he'd been working on a documentary called Coup 53 about the Iranian
Yeah.
uh, dealings with MI5 and the CIA and the coup that happened.
Yeah.
And that had gone on and off for 4 years whilst he was cutting that, and they were cutting a bit and then having to raise a bit more money to cut a bit more and keep it going. And I emailed Walter about something he'd mentioned in that interview back in 2013. He'd quoted a journalist from the Chicago World's Fair about how it had burnt down, and whilst it had been lost, it would still live forever. And it was a really poignant quote. I mean, Walter is an incredible wordsmith, and
Yeah.
he's extremely cerebral, as you know.
Yeah. There's nothing quite
So
like getting an email from Walter, is there? There's
that's
always something
right.
attached to the bottom.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that's it. So there's always an amazing quote or something
Yeah.
inspiring or something brilliant,
Hmm.
and well beyond just the realm of film, but right into psychology and whatever.
Mm.
So so he'd share this lovely quote with me during the interview, and I was writing about something, and I wanted to use it and make sure I attributed it to the correct journalist. So. I wrote to Walter and said, "Do you remember the quote you gave me?" And of course he did. And along with his reply, he sent me a chapter in PDF format of a book that he's writing. It's coming out this March called
Yeah.
Suddenly Something Clicked,
Hmm.
and it's about his thoughts. It's 2 volumes. It might be three actually, but I think it's certainly two. Half of it is about his thoughts on his experiences working in film, and the other half his other kind of collective thoughts, which kind of go off in many different directions.
Yeah.
Um, and this chapter was about Moviola editing, and it was because he'd shown me whilst we visited him on that first meeting, cinefilm of a whole bunch of Bay Area editors taking part in what they called the Droid Olympics, which were
Oh
four
yeah.
different sets of summer games
Yeah.
that they did in his front garden. And it
Yes.
was, who could hand wind a reel of film with the other hand behind their back, and who could speed splice and join, the highest number in a certain amount of time. And
Yeah.
I think he told me there was one where you had to stop the Moviola frame counter exactly on 30 frames or something like
Right.
that. So, whilst blindfolded. So they did, so they'd done that, and he sent me this chapter which was all about Moviola editing, in which he'd kind of written the process down. It was very much kind of instructional. This is how it was done, and this is what used to happen. And on a typical film, we would be doing these actions, and he'd put in some anecdotes. And at the very end, he'd written a little paragraph which said, "It's such a shame that no one has thought to ever put to film this process from start to finish,
Mm.
whilst those of us who remember how to do so are still alive and the equipment is still available." And no one can dangle a carrot in front of my head like that without me taking the bait. So I wrote back and said, "Did you mean that last paragraph? Do you want to make a film of this?" And he'd been thinking about it for 16 years. He'd approached
Mm,
a couple of people at UCLA and other places in California, and the answer was always kind of, well, maybe, but not really. And so the moment I said, "Well, look, would you like to do this for real?" He said, "Yes, let's do it." And then he sent me a shopping list, which was a page long of all the things that I'd need to get to reassemble the Moviola cutting room.
yeah.
And he said, "Talk to me when you've got those things."
Because that is quite a shopping list. The film kind of opens with that. There's so
Mm,
much. I mean, this is the thing that it isn't just about, the moviola itself. It's about the whole process, everything that goes behind it. Also, you go into the
yeah.
sort of psychology of why certain edits are made and just that kind of destructive process that editing was back then. But talk to me about this shopping list because you found the moviola on eBay, right?
Yeah, so eBay was amazingly a great resource. I set
Right.
up a kind of saved search for a number of the things. Some of them I knew I'd come into contact with in my previous life as a VFX editor. I'd worked on the Steenbeck before,
Mm,
so I'd cut 35 millimeter before, so I knew splicers, joiners, joining tape,
hmm.
and that kind of thing. But I hadn't used a Moviola before, and I hadn't used a numbering machine. So I was a little bit in the dark about some of these things. But yeah, it was this big list, and the first thing was an Acme numbering machine, which I found on eBay, incorrectly labeled. Someone described it as a lamp, which I thought was really funny, or a decorative ornament. And so I purchased that immediately, and that lived in my house for over a year before we even started filming,
Mm,
and I just thought, I hope this thing works because it looks pretty vintage.
yeah.
And then the Moviola, the first one I got, I ended up buying two,
Right.
and the first one was an eBay purchase, and I drove down to Hastings, and it was someone who had bought it from their local cinema, and that he didn't
Right.
know quite what he was going to do with it, but he'd bought it a while ago, thinking it might be nice around the house as a talking point, and
Mm,
then he decided he'd never really done anything with it, and he was going to have a clear out.
mm.
So I popped down to Hastings and put it in the back of my Fiat 500, which was
Just
amazing
about
that
fit.
it. Oh God, yeah. I mean, thank goodness the top half separates from the legs.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so that was the first one, and then something told me get another one just in case. So I bought a second one from a guy who has a huge kind of barn, I suppose is the best word to describe it. It is actually on a farm, so a barn is probably the right word, and it's filled with projectors and film equipment from time gone by.
Mm,
I think he bought the entire post production facility from Pinewood when they upgraded to digital, and so he just
right.
bought everything.
Wow.
And so he had a few moviolas, and I bought one from him as well. And he was in Kent, so he was not as far. He was a little bit closer to the M25, thank goodness. So I went and picked that one up as well. But I found him through. He was selling other items on eBay that I needed, and so in the end, I just picked up the phone and spoke to him and said, "What else have you got?" And it turned out he had a treasure trove.
Wow.
So that was very helpful.
Very cool. Yeah, I mean, I dealt with some of that stuff in the early 2000s when I worked for London Editing Machines. Actually, I put an editing bench together for Walter himself on Cold Mountain, um,
Right.
but that was using Final Cut.
He was
But
on
yeah,
Final Cut for that.
yeah, but
Yeah.
we had chems, we had Steambecks. I remember getting those things in the elevators in tiny post production facilities in the West End. It's kind of why I stopped doing the job. Actually, it drove me mad. But there was something that really struck me then, just how archaic the film industry even was then in the early 2000s. People were still shooting on film, and I was working in TV as well, and we were just moving, I guess, towards 60:9, from 4:3, and getting into the digital era. And there's film all the way back at the start of the century, and the Moviola is this kind of behemoth, isn't it? I mean, it's not a huge thing, but it's a big sort of industrial, dangerous feeling piece of equipment. It's not like my trackpad that I have in front of me here and my nice monitors. You're kind of
It's a
locked
lump.
into this
Yeah.
thing. Yeah,
It,
it's like a
it
sewing machine
weighs.
almost.
I compared it to a sewing machine mixed with a submarine because that's kind
Yeah,
of how it
right.
feels like. I mean, it weighs half a ton. And I mean, when I got the one from Hastings home,
Mm.
I could lift it out of my car and put it back on its wheels, but there's steps to my house front door, and I couldn't get it up the steps. And in the end, I called Katharina Kubrick and said, "Can you send your boyfriend round to help me lift us into the house?" Uh,
You've
which
got
is what
some
I ended up doing.
connections, you have.
So, poor fellow, didn't know he was going to get to that, did he? So, having to lug around stuff for me. But yeah, that was kind of funny. But I mean, yeah, they're really heavy. They're kind of like hammerite, the kind of metal texture that they've got on
Yeah.
them. And yeah, they're mean looking. You worry about losing a finger or something if you
Yeah.
prod the wrong thing.
Yeah, well,
So
but getting those must have been, a big part of it. But obviously, there's so many different smaller things that you have to have, like finding the numbering tape. I mean, there were things that
yeah.
were difficult to find, really, really difficult.
Yeah, I mean, Walter describes it as, for want of a nail, you can't, put the sole of the shoe together, and for want of not being able to put the sole together, you've lost the shoe entirely, and it's that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So without numbering tape, we wouldn't have been able to proceed at all with
Mm.
editing the film or cutting the film, because every piece of film that goes in the Moviola, from the picture side and the sound side, has to have numbers printed on it, and it's the same numbers on each corresponding picture or audio. So, yeah, numbering tape, I don't know what it's made from. It's some sort of polymer or something, or wax. I'm
Mm.
not sure. Something that melts anyway.
Yeah.
And as this metal block that's heated to 150 degrees rotates round, the numbers on it roll up one by one.
Mm.
Bit like when you go to the post office and someone's kind of stamping the date and things on it. It's one of those kind of proper heavy metal things. Um, and through my own research, I found out that Ken Loach had looked for numbering tape in 2013 when he was still editing on film with I think a Moviola, um, and he'd put a call out to the industry, and that was in the Guardian. And then I found the follow-up article saying Ken Loach has had his film saved thanks to Pixar, who
Which
had
is the
found the numbering
yeah
tape, which is such
the
a strange
weirdest,
thing. Yeah.
most
So,
unexpected.
the most digital kind of place you might think
Exactly.
of. But they had a supply of numbering tape they'd sent to Ken Loach. So back I go to Lee Unkrich, who at the time wasn't working there anymore, but was previously former vice president of editorial. So I thought,
Mm.
well, he'll know
Yeah.
where it's kept or who to speak to. And he said, look, I'll put you in touch. And Steve Bloom at Pixar um, got in touch with me and said, I have to ask the management of the company to see if we can let you have some. And in the end, they approved it, and so we got 7 reels of numbering tape from Pixar, which
Wow.
is
The last in the
crazy.
world, probably. So, I mean,
Well,
there's some buried
it's
away somewhere, but
yeah,
just being able to have that connection to find that's pretty amazing. But
that
then
was it.
you've got all of these things together. I remember those numbering machines would break quite a lot. I spent a lot of my 10 months working for that London editing machines, going back and fixing them. And did you have somebody kind of with you to oversee maintenance and repair, or was it just a matter of scrabbling together to try and get things working if they did break?
Scrabbling together is definitely the right description.
Yeah.
So, like I said, I bought 2 Moviolas. I also ended up buying 2 numbering machines.
Mm.
Something told me, this one had sat in my house for a year and had been fairly well behaved. But I had this feeling about 2 weeks before the shoot, maybe I should buy a second one just in case. And the second one arrived, and the person who sent it didn't send it in any protected packaging,
Yeah.
and it arrived trashed.
Oh no.
Um, but the insides were kind of okay, I think. And but the front was all smashed in, and I was at the point of returning it and screaming at this person for being a complete nit. Uh, but it got to the point that we were about to start filming, and I kind of thought, oh, look, I've got other things to deal with. I'll just sit on that for a while. And then about 2 days into us using the first numbering machine I bought, it blew up. It just stopped working. And it turned out that there was a little plate that was meant to be on the outside had somehow been put inside it, and it had made contact with part of the circuitry and
Right.
fried it or something. Anyway, I had a technician at the university who is
Mm.
extremely brilliant with practical hands-on things. And his name's Paul, and I went to Paul and said, help, this thing's blown up. We need to carry on using it tomorrow. And I gave him both of them, the kind of knackered one and this one that had been working up to then. And overnight, I don't know what he did, but he said to me the one that had arrived all broken, the insides of it, he said, had a much more modern kind of circuit board installed on it. It's like someone had kind of upgraded it. And he said he kind of swapped them around and took bits and Frankenstein bits from the other one into the one that had been working. And I don't know how he did it, but he made it work overnight. And
Wow.
so we have now a working machine again for the very next day. So I was rescued by the goodwill of lovely Paul, who, you know, wasn't meant to be at my beck and call, but ended up getting dragged into it, as most of the people around me did. And yeah, with a lot of goodwill and his brilliant know-how, he made that work, which
That
was
that was the
very
exact
lucky.
phrase I was going to use. The goodwill that kind of surrounds you, how with all the projects you've done, I think has served you very well. You know, you've always come across as somebody who's very passionate about what they do, but has always been able to make these relationships with people that, you know, people will step up for you. You know, in a moment of crisis. I think.
It's, you know, I thought about this project a lot, and I always feel like this Moviola film is the culmination of 15 years
Yeah,
of making connections and making friends
yeah, I've
with
seen it
people
happening.
who've, yeah, you've been on Twitter and following me, and I've been following you all across this period,
Yeah.
and you know, like through being friends with the Kubricks, that made the intro to Spielberg, through being working on stuff that the Kubricks had done about The Shining, that led to Lee Unkrich at
Mm,
Pixar, and and then all the other stuff along the way with Elstree, and then this whole film, literally, we filmed. Elstree Studios got us in with new owners at the BBC, and so I ended up filming the Moviola film at the BBC, and they gave us space for free. Um, so that was part of it. Elstree Studios contributed to the budget. Um, yeah, and everyone was kind of from one of these previous things that I'd done along the way, who'd kind of seen me scrabbling around trying to put on a screening here or an event here or something, just because I happen to just love all these things.
mm, mm.
And you know, along the way they've kind of got on board and said yes, and in this case, you know, I was able to draw on that even more, and so many more people were able to kind of help out. So
Yeah, that's awesome.
yeah,
That's great.
it was a lovely feeling. You know,
Yeah.
it was so nice to feel so supported.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and so you've got the equipment now. We've talked about that. We, you know, Walter's on board. He's sort of been the spark for the whole thing. How
yeah.
does Mike Lee get involved in the project? Because you then need rushes on
Yeah.
film of a film that you can use. I mean, that's just a whole other viper's nest you're going into. They're trying to get all of that.
Totally crazy. And this was on Walter's shopping list was um I can't remember the phrase he used, but it was kind of like not a generous director, but someone like in tune with what we were trying to do. So
Yeah,
I think he said a sympathetic director.
sure.
Uh, so someone who would actually let us have access to rushes from at least a scene. It was the idea that we were going to do one scene
Mm,
from one of their films. They would just let us play with,
mm,
literally, give it to us and not interfere and
yeah,
not be precious, and not say, well, you can't show the things that we didn't show in the finished version, you know. And and Walter suggested Christopher Nolan
mm,
as someone who is very passionate about keeping film alive. The two of them had been at a panel at the BFI with other important kind of film people. Edgar Wright was there,
hmm,
he told me, and the BFI had kind of brought them in and said, "What are we going to do about film?" was the question they
mm,
posed, which is a bit of a weird open-ended question. So Walter said, "How about Christopher Nolan?" Now, I did have access to Christopher Nolan through the fact that I'd worked on VFX on Inception and The Dark Knight.
mm.
And also, he had just recently done that 2001 restoration, whatever it
Yes.
was, for the Kubricks for Cannes. And so I thought, well, I could try going down that route, but I was a little anxious of it because I thought that he might be a bit protective of his footage. And also, We would need digital rushes of everything. And just at this point, this is now 2020, we're kind of going on this, and COVID hits. And so in the meantime, Walter has been invited to participate in a series of online chats with a Zoom audience. Um, and these were being run, I don't know, maybe once every 2 weeks or once a month. And the organizer of them was someone that Lee introduced me to. And Lee had given a talk about Coco. So the idea is you've already watched the film, and then you'll come to this chat, and it's an hour chat with somebody from the film in a lead creative role
Hmm.
who will talk about it, and the host asks questions, but the audience can ask questions too. And so Lee had done Toy Story 3 and Coco. Walter then was about to come on and do Return to Oz.
Mm.
So of course I jumped on that, and being invited, I said, "Oh, I'd love to hear you talk about Return to Oz. I can't get enough of that." So he did that, and then it turned out that Mike Lee had been doing a couple of these, and he ended up doing about four more after that point that I joined in the audience, and he was very receptive to the questions, and he was very generous with his time, and I thought this could be the right person to approach.
Mm.
So I wrote to the organizer, Joshua, and I said, "Hey, Walter and I have actually got together to do a mad project, and we'd like to speak to Mike Lee about maybe getting him involved. Could you do an intro?" So he said, "Sure," did an intro, and I get an email from Mike Lee saying, "What is it that you want to do? Can you explain it to me?" So I write him an email step by step, kind of outlining what it is that we were intending, that we would want his footage from one of his films, and that we want to cut it and, put it through a Moviola cutting room. And he wrote back and said, "I think we should talk about this. Obviously, we can't face to face. Let's have a Zoom call, you and I." So about a couple of weeks later, we have a Zoom call, and he opens it with, "I think you should know, I have looked up everything there is to know about you." And I thought, oh my God. I mean, there's not much to know anyway. So I kind of said that, and he went, "Yes, well, I've worked that one out." And then kind of smiled, and I thought, okay, he's all right. He's going to be okay. He said, "Look, I understood what you wrote. I want you to now say it to me so I can actually hear you talk it through, from your own mouth."
Mm.
So I did, and at the end, he kind of sat there and he stroked his beard a little bit, and then he went, "You're completely nuts. You can have anything of mine you like."
Amazing.
And that was it, really. So then we did have another meeting. I brought Walter in, so Walter, was there to thank him and assure him, that we're not trying to make a comparison between Walter's cut and the actual cut. It
Hmm.
wasn't about that. It was about the process and the craft of editing.
Mm.
But yeah, Mike then just put me in touch with his assistant,
Hmm.
and Sally then said to me, "Let me know what film you want, and we'll arrange getting you the footage." And Walter and I initially thought we might go with Peterloo because it was his most recent film, and it had been shot digitally, so we knew
Yeah.
that we'd be able to get our hands on the rushes on the file.
Which
And
you would
then
then reverse engineer into film rushes.
that's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
I'd already found a place that was going to be able to print 35 mil
Mm.
through a friend of mine called Jim Cummings, who I'm sure you're aware of. He's
Yeah.
a filmmaker himself.
Hmm.
He'd been over at the Prince Charles cinema with Thunder Road, and
Yeah.
he'd
Right.
had it projected on 35 mil. And I said, "But surely you shot this digitally?" And he said, "Oh yeah, but it looks cool on film." And I said, "Well, where did you get that done?" Thinking he was going to say Los Angeles, and he said, "Oh, somewhere in south of England." So he put me in touch with a company who printed from digital rushes.
Mm.
So we then actually ended up settling on Mr. Turner. Walter found two scenes he really liked that were not too complicated, no effects and anything over the top. It
Hmm.
was, an exterior and interior arrival scene and a dialogue scene around a table.
Yeah.
And we were really happy with those because it would enable him to demonstrate what he wanted to demo. And so I wrote to Sally and said, "We'd like Mr. Turner, please." And one day the Avid hard drive of the film turned up at my house with the entire cut of the film and all the bins and all the string outs from every scene. And
Wow.
I thought, oh gosh, I better not lose this. So, and yeah, I went down to Kent. It was another place in Kent, with the drive, and we got the 35 mm picture print done, and it was the film props, the other Moviola guy in Kent, who with the big barn, he was the one I eventually found out had a MagnaSync audio recorder with a magnetic head that could do 35 millimeter stripe audio,
Hmm.
where I ended up going and I plugged my laptop with the Avid timeline on it with a mini jack cable coming out to the RCA phono, and that went into the back of this huge thing. It was about 7 foot tall, and we went through 9.5 reels of mag stripe transferring the audio from those two scenes across,
Wow.
which was about a day and a half before we started filming,
Wow.
and I had no idea whether the audio had transferred or not because it didn't have an amplifier attached, so we couldn't hear it as it was playing back. But just the little VU kind of needle going,
Yeah.
and I just was sitting there kind of going, please, 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 what? Uh, and yeah, it wasn't until Dan got it onto the synchronizer on the first day of filming and was winding it, and you could hear it go past the magnetic head,
Yeah.
that we knew there was audio.
Yeah,
So
yeah. We should mention that Dan Farrell's involved, who's an editor himself and worked
yeah,
with Walter as an assistant editor. And I think the film does an amazing job of just, well, reminding me, but telling other people, I'm sure, that don't have this knowledge, that it's a very technical job being an editor and an edit assistant. It isn't just a matter of being freed up by the tools like we expect today. Yeah, obviously it's still technical to a certain extent, but it's physical, and there's a lot of preparation to be done, and there's a lot of dealing with numbers, like you're talking about the numbering machine, and adding leader on it, and writing on the actual film itself to mark where the gate is and everything. All of that stuff. It's quite laborious and very technical, and I think that comes across really well in the film via Walter. And via Dan, did you have
yeah.
to speak to? Was it John Gregory that that edited Mr. Turner? Did he have to be involved at any point because you were sort of recutting his cut almost?
Yeah, no, we didn't have to. It was literally Mike, and he just said, "It's my film. You
Fine.
can help yourself."
Yeah, yeah,
But I thought at one point we might have to go and get permission from Timothy Spall and everyone who's in the
yeah.
scenes. But no, Mike just said, "Look, we've got all the rights. I
Good.
could do with it what I like. I'm letting
Yeah,
you now do with it what you like."
yeah,
So we were very, very lucky in that sense that I didn't have to kind of go piecemeal one by one to everyone, like
yeah.
the DOP or the sound recordist as well. But
Nice. I guess
that
because
was
Mike
lucky.
is individual in that way that he kind of, his film is his film, right? It's
Yes.
distributed, yes, by a studio, but it's his film. I was also interested because obviously I supported the project. As soon as I saw it come up, I was very intrigued to see it made and wanted to make sure, I had a part in it being made, because I think, it's very important to preserve these stories, these historical, artifacts, the Moviola being one of them. Did you ever consider going down the route of a Talking Heads documentary, or did you always have this locked idea that it was going to be Walter and his assistant in the room, working his way through it, describing it, talking about the technical aspects, talking about the psychological aspects of, making those choices, those creative choices? Was there ever a time where you thought you needed more contributors? I think it's really nice and
Yeah.
economical as it is. This is not a want from me.
No, no, sure.
Yeah,
That in my mind, I thought maybe it would be interesting. The plan was always it was going to be a reconstruction. So it was always going to be Walter and Dan demonstrating the tools as if they had just the footage had come from a lab and here we were in a cutting room again. But I did at one point suggest, well, it would be nice to have some, tales from the cutting room kind of moments with other directors and other editors, like in pairs, talking about a particular moment that they'd had with a moviola or something like that. And Walter said, no, it's not that kind of film. I think we should stick. I mean, Walter used the phrase to me, nuts and bolts. He said,
Yeah.
we're doing the nuts and bolts, um, and we should really try and stick to that. And so I was very happy to go with what Walter wanted. It was
Yeah.
Walter's idea after all, and I
Yeah.
wasn't going to start trying to impress upon him what I thought maybe could
Mm.
go into it. So that it wasn't really even a discussion. It was more like a kind of, well, maybe no, and it was kind of no within, you know, 30 seconds of that even kind of coming as a thought.
Mm.
So the nuts and bolts was what Walter wanted, and so that's what we did. And in fact, when I delivered the first cut, jumping ahead a bit, but
Mm.
when I did the editing as well as
Yeah.
producing and directing the thing, because why not give myself more work?
Because you're a lunatic. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Well, like you know what that's like, right? So
Yeah.
so I cut the thing, and when I showed Walter the first cut, I had in the back of my mind the whole time whilst I was editing it, it's about the nuts and bolts.
Mm.
And he watched it and he went, it's a bit too nuts and boltsy because I hadn't included any of the kind of big discussion moments and the bits that are in the film now.
Yeah.
And I said, oh, I wasn't too sure whether you wanted any of these conversational moments. He's like, I think it could have a little bit of conversation.
Mm.
And so he left me to it again, and I came back with a new version where I literally what you see in the finished film is pretty much what I produced
Mm.
for
Mm.
the second cut,
Mm.
and we didn't make any changes after that, other than minor kind of, trim 1 second here, change that. Is there a shot that illustrates this? But it was never a substantial change after that point. But yeah, I mean that it was always meant to be a reconstruction right from the start, and it was going to be a process film.
Yeah.
I was just always concerned, are we making an instruction manual for people on how to use equipment that they're not going to use?
Mm.
But I don't think it is that.
It's not at all.
So that was why I was thinking about the idea of maybe we could have other voices, but it was right not to in the end.
Mm. There's so many lovely moments in it, and I can listen to Walter talk all day. I mean, you've been to his talks, you've spent a lot of time with him
Yeah.
in recent times as well. I saw him probably a month or so ago, maybe a month, 2 months ago. And I just love the sound of his voice, and I think he's just got such a great presence. But he's a tall guy as well. But what I loved in this film of yours is that little tense moment where he's sitting with Mike Leigh and he's showing him his cut of Mr. Turner. There's this kind of nervousness I've never seen in him before. And it sort of reminds us of that relationship between the director and the editor, where sometimes editors were just left alone to do their own thing. And the director came in now and again, especially, I think they describe it, don't they? Both him and Dan describe it. It was a noisy, busy, horrible kind of environment. So directors didn't want to be in there. But there is that moment where Mike takes a kind of pause after looking at it and he goes, right, this is what I think. And I love that moment where he says that one of Walter's choices was perfectly valid or something, or I can't remember the phrase he uses.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
You kind of see Walter just kind of go, good. You can see the kind of young man in him at that point. I think it's a really nice little interaction.
It was funny, that moment. It was tense because we were meant to shoot it the day before. We'd all gone to the Kubrick estate where we filmed the Steenbeck, where we were reviewing, and Mike's train didn't come. He was coming up from London, and there'd been a big accident somewhere along the line, I think at St Pancras, and poor old Mike had been standing in the summer heat in the underground for an hour trying to get to us and couldn't get there. And so we rescheduled for the very next day. And I decided that I wasn't going to risk public transport, so I sent someone to pick him up from his house as a driver and come and drive him back up. But aside from the Zoom call that had taken place 2 years previously, Walter and Mike had never met. And so when Mike arrives in the cutting room on film in the documentary, that's literally them meeting for the very first time in person.
Wow.
and it's on camera. So I think there was a bit of apprehension and a bit of nervousness.
Yeah.
What is he going to say? What's he going to make of what we've done? Um, is he going to be amused? Is he going to get it? Is he going to be angry? We really didn't know. And I think there was some apprehension that comes across, and that Walter was kind of justified maybe having, of well, we got to wait and see what he's going to say. And yeah,
Yeah.
he does pause, and he does critique parts of what Walter did, and there's a reason. Walter uses a shot of a boat three times,
Mm,
and he uses it at one point as a transitional shot between the two scenes.
mm,
The reason he did that was totally justified in the fact that in the real film, Turner goes off, he arrives at Margate, gets his room, but then he goes for a nice long walk,
mm,
and it's this kind of silent montage sequence of him walking along, I don't know, canals or wherever it is in Margate that he goes walking, with beautiful, beautiful cinematography, but not very interesting for us to show if we
mm,
were going to demonstrate cutting. So we didn't ever print that scene with all
mm.
that footage. And so we needed something to bridge from he's now upstairs to now he's downstairs. And so Walter used that shot. So Mike picked up on that and said, well, don't know why you've used this boat shot three times. You're drawing too much attention to it, which, in is a real legitimate comment. But, in the circumstances, there was a reason why Walter did that.
Yeah, and you're doing a scene in isolation as well, whereas
That's
Mike's
right.
obviously thinking of the film. And we should say as well that this part of the film, the documentary that you've made, is not the purpose of the project. This is just a
No,
nice little benefit of it, that you've got the two of them interacting, and
that's right.
and it
That's
tells
right.
us about, as I said, that interaction between the director and the editor, and I thought that was
Yeah.
fascinating. Yeah.
It's down to Mike's generosity that, not
Yes.
only did he let us have the footage, but he also agreed to be in the film and provide a critique on camera for us spontaneously. It's the real thing. It's not rehearsed. He hadn't seen what we'd done. He had no concept of what he was going to see.
Mm.
And we put him on the spot, shoved a camera in his face, and said, "Go." So huge amount of trust in us and
Yeah.
generosity as the filmmakers. And he did a perfect job. He
Mm.
said, "This is what I like. This is what I don't like." Absolutely his right to do that as the director. And then originally in our plan, in Walter's outline of what we would do, the plan was that we would go back to Elstree and then film Walter recutting or making changes based on the notes that he'd received from
Right.
Mike. Because we were already a kind of day late because of
Mm.
the trains and things, we did do that and we filmed it, um, but I didn't put it into the final cut because I kind of felt like it's just showing more splicing and joining in a
Yes.
way, which I felt we'd already covered, and it was just going to
Yes.
artificially make the film a bit more long than it needed to. So I made the decision not to include the recut. But what we've done is that I recorded the recut version back on the Kubrick Steenbeck from the screen, and I put it up on our website for the film, so that if anyone wants to see what Walter then did
Oh,
and see the
cool.
finished version, it's there on our website for the film.
I'll be checking that out. I didn't realize that was
Yeah,
there. I really liked how Dan and Walter, they're sitting there together in the editing room and talking about how quickly it became familiar again. And you can see them. There's those moments where once you've got past the kind of descriptive part of it, all of the elements that you had to draw together to make the room, Walter and Dan begin to sort of have this dance almost between them. He's asking for a particular piece of film, and Dan's going off and getting it, and he's going round him, and you can see they're in this tight space, and it just feels like it really sort of sparked something in the two of them again.
yeah, it's lovely. It is almost like some sort of kind of balletic kind of thing that goes
Yeah.
on, where it's like choreographed the way they move. And there's a moment where Walter, without even looking, kind of just holds up a piece of film that he's just spliced and just lifts
Yes.
it in the air, and Dan's arm is already coming in to pick it up from him.
Yeah. Yeah.
Without him having to kind of wave it at him or say, "Look," and there's another bit where I love this bit where Dan kind of reaches around Walter's body to
Yeah.
goes, "Oh, I
Exactly.
just need to reach," and he kind of goes around one arm and then the other arm to kind of thread
Yeah.
it through onto the horse, and yeah, I mean it really did just come immediately back to them, I think. Um, at the end of the film, they say it's a bit like riding a bike, perhaps, because of the
Yeah.
physicality. You remember where your hands are and your arms are and how you move, which Walter later said to me when he's editing digitally, he doesn't have that level of recall. It takes him 3 or 4 days because the difference with mechanical editing is huge movements, whereas,
Mm.
as you will know, digital editing, it's you're doing that with your
Yeah.
finger,
Yeah.
and one key press is pretty much like any other key press.
Yes, that's a good
So,
point. Yeah,
so he
yeah.
said it takes him. It was surprised how quicker it was for him to pick up doing a moviola, which, I mean, I think the last time Walter said he touched a moviola was on Return to Oz, which is 40
Right, yeah.
years ago.
Yeah.
So, yeah, quite impressive.
Wow. Um, you edited this film, as you said. I mean, you're editing a film about editing. I mean, it gets pretty meta there. But did you feel any? How much pressure did you feel? Because I know you're a very competent editor. You've done a lot of projects in the past, and you teach, film at Hertfordshire University. But did you feel any extra pressure given the subject matter?
Not just the subject matter, but also who the film was for. In the first instance, with it being for Walter,
Yeah.
probably one of the most revered living film editors there is, and whose idea this was, and so therefore I've got to give it, the best shot and do the most justice to it. So, yeah, I was anxious,
Mm.
very much. I mean, we had about 130 hours of footage from 4 different cameras to put together. I didn't have an assistant. A lot of the cameras were not set up the best way for me for post. I did comment to my DOP on the first day, and let's just say I'm not particularly happy with that they didn't sync time code.
Right.
So
Yeah, because you've
we
got
had a
multiple. Well, we should say that you've got multiple cameras at points as well, because you're
yeah, oh
following Dan
yeah.
through the process, or all through the process, and you've got multiple angles going on to show the
Sometimes there
equipment, to show them. Yeah,
That's right. Sometimes there were 4 cameras all running at the same
yeah,
time, looking at different things. And so it took me 3 months to synchronize the rushes, but that was 3 months on top of doing my day job. So, we filmed this in
yes,
August. My day job as a lecturer begins really again in September, and then I'm teaching 4 days a week,
hmm,
Monday to Thursday perhaps. So I was doing this in my evenings and on weekends, between September to Christmas time, just synchronizing, and before I could even get beginning to edit. But yeah, I did feel pressure, and Walter and I had never discussed that I was going to edit the film. I wanted to edit the film. I
right,
wanted that opportunity, um, just as much as I wanted this opportunity to have a go at producing and directing this. But we never had a sit down where we discussed, oh, well, you'll do that role, I'll do this role,
mm,
on paper or anything like that. It was always Walter was the writer of the film because it was his concept and he's the star of the film. And the production and everything else was left to me.
mm.
So, on the last day of shooting, as Walter was leaving, and the crew and I were packing up the equipment, Walter said, "Well, call me when you've got a cut." And I was like, "Okay, all right, I'll do that then." So that kind of just solidified. Oh yeah, yeah, I am editing this then, which I was delighted with. But you know, Walter took a gamble on me
Mm.
massively. There's a huge amount of trust and generosity that's gone into this because who the hell am I, right? I mean, I don't have a feature documentary in my CV really. I don't have a broadcast documentary career behind me. I've been a VFX editor for a year working at DNEG,
Mm.
cutting VFX, but a lot of that is conforming. It's not very much of your own creative stuff.
Mm.
And then for 15 years, I'd been making small amounts of what I suppose people call content these days, where I had made sort of mini oral history documentaries about some of the interviews that I'd done around Elstree, and I had sort of accidentally made a 55-minute oral history of The Shining, which was never planned to be like that. I mean, it was a 20-minute originally, and then that version I put online got 45,000 hits in a week.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, I've got lots more. I'll just expand it. It was
Yeah.
not planned to be a film. It wasn't shot as a film. It was a series of different individual oral histories.
Mm.
So, like, just like Mike Lee has kind of said, I've looked up everything there is to know about you, and I'm going, well, there's not very much. Walter, really did take a punt. He could have gone to a professional filmmaker who'd got documentaries into festivals. He was working with Taggy
Mm.
from Coup 53,
Yeah.
the director and producer and writer of that documentary. He could have said, well, why don't you direct and produce Taggy, and Howard, you can, help in whatever way that you want to or
Mm.
something.
Mm.
But because I'd said I'd like to do this, and Walter wanted to give me a chance, I think,
Mm.
so there's a deep amount of trust that I am just extremely grateful to. I felt I knew I could do it. I felt like I was up to it. I felt like I had the skills, but I'd never had the chance to prove it in this way. So, so for me, it's just something that I will forever be grateful to. That not only did I do the on set production directing roles, but the edit, which is where my heart always is anyway, because I love editing and
Mm.
it's always been my passion. Um, that means even more, I think.
Mm.
So I just feel extraordinarily lucky in
Yeah.
that position.
Yeah, it's very cool. And where is the film at the moment in its kind of life? I've seen that you've been to some festivals and things. Well, how have they been going? How's the
Yeah,
reception been?
the reception's been bizarre, like in a really good way.
Yeah.
Um, Again, like not having had this experience of having not really having a project that has then gone out to an audience in the
Mm.
same way as this. When you make a project, it's your baby, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's your baby all the time until suddenly you kind of then have to share it with people. And with this, we got I entered it into a number of festivals on Film Freeway because the advice is, oh, if you want to enter our festival, you've got to go in via Film Freeway. I mean,
Hmm.
what I've learned from this experience is that film festivals and entering film festivals, it's like working with the mafia. It's something completely bizarre, and 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 yes, whilst you're meant to enter your film via Film Freeway, half of the people, or if not two-thirds of the people who've got their film in there, did not enter their film through Film Freeway, but they've got a sales agent and they've got a distributor and
Yeah.
they've made a deal with the programmers.
Hmm.
So that's already taken a slot before they even look at the Film Freeway entries,
Right.
and then kind of fill out the back with them. So I entered a whole load of these, and all of them were reject, 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 reject. We don't want your film. Thanks so much. Yeah, it was a strong year this year, and eventually I worked this out. Like actually, they've given the review job to the 20 kids from the local film school who were looking for work experience,
Yeah.
and they've probably got 1,000 of these. So they're looking at the first 10 minutes and then going next. So it was a very surreal experience entering into film festivals. And we wrote to Sheffield Dot Fest after I'd already applied through Film Freeway. Um, and they wrote back and said, we would love to have this, which we weren't expecting. They'd actually rejected Coup 53.
Yeah.
So, um, but we thought, well, we'll try it again with this one. And they said yes. So that was our debut festival, which is fantastic for us, one of the top three documentary film festivals really in the world. And on the back of that, I arranged a kind of big PR hit with to go out, press release to go out about the film, the project, and everything that had gone along with it. And it got picked up by the Guardian, and we got a review request from Peter Bradshaw,
Yeah. A
which
great review as well.
it was an incredible
Yeah.
review. And I was so nervous because I knew it was coming out whilst we were in the screening of the first screening in Sheffield.
Mm.
So I had my phone off and we did a screening and a Q&A. And when I came out, and the audience had been lovely. That was my first taste of other people seeing it
Mm.
and saying, we loved this. Thank you so much for making it, which was, really a pleasure.
Mm.
But I turned my phone back on when we walked out of the cinema and had about 25 messages from people congratulating me for the Guardian review, which I hadn't even seen. And Peter had written a 4-star review calling it a geekgasm,
Yeah.
which
For analog fans, wasn't
for
it? Yeah.
analog fans.
Yeah.
And I just thought, oh my God, yeah, several people had written geekgasm to me on a text. And I was like, what are they on about? um, and then that was it in the headline. So, Peter totally got what we were trying to do.
Yeah.
I was very concerned. I thought, oh my God, he's going to think this is really niche and mad. But he did think it was really niche and mad, but in a really good way. So we got this overwhelmingly positive review. We got lovely response from the audience at Sheffield. We did 2 screenings, 2 Q&As, and then we got the invite to Telluride, which was just completely unexpected. And we got 2 screenings offered to us at Telluride Film Festival. Thelma Schoonmaker came to the first screening,
Wow.
which was just amazing. And I like sitting in the screening and listening to how the audience are reacting, because there's moments in the film that are funny,
Yeah.
and if you notice, if the audience are laughing along, they're kind of with you,
Yes.
and they're enjoying it and they're buying into it. And and when Thelma started laughing, I relaxed because that was good. There was a bit where we were talking about the repetition of it all, and she just went, "Oh yes," and so that was great. And then it was
Amazing.
so popular at Telluride, they gave us a 3rd screening. They added
Wow.
it to the schedule, and then we screened at the Lumiere Festival in Lyon in France, and we've got another festival announcement that's coming tomorrow,
Hmm.
for another festival in the United States. And the American Cinema Editors screened it as part of their Edit Fest,
Wow.
as well. So, we're very pleased with how it's doing so far.
Amazing. That's so cool, Howard. I'm so happy for you because I know that your heart is in
Yeah,
this. I can see it on the screen, but
yeah.
from what I've read on social media over the time you've been doing it and the newsletters we get, I can
Yeah,
see
I've
how
been
much it
trying to
means to
share
you.
the updates with all the backers. And,
Yeah.
the backers have been great because so many of those people are from the industry as well. There's a lot of them
Yes.
who are film editors. I was entering the credits. I was suddenly going, I know that name. I know
Yeah.
that name as well,
Yeah, I spotted
and
when I
it was
watched it
great.
today. Todd Vaziri, ILM, is on there, and
Yes,
I
yeah,
just put
yeah.
on social media earlier. I said, "Can you name the film where both myself and Todd Vaziri have a credit?" One of my most dedicated followers, David Griffiths, immediately replied with the poster of your films,
Ah, that's
saying, "Was it
nice.
this?"
Yeah,
But yeah, there's some interesting names on there for sure because I think you know those people are the enthusiasts. The people that work in the industry now are the people that were drawn into the industry for their love of the films that people like Walter
totally.
worked
Yeah,
on and Mike worked on. So, no, it really is a great film, and
yeah.
I want everybody to see it. How can people see it? Is there a time when people are going to be able to see it?
So I'm hoping after we finish our kind of year on festival circuit,
Yeah.
there's another one that I'm really holding out for that have got a screener of it. They were meant to let me know before Christmas, but I've decided not to bug them. But that would be quite an exciting one if that happens in February. And then I've just had an Italian documentary film festival reach out to ask for a screener. So we're still going on that front, but
Cool.
after a year of doing that, then we're going to look at well, we're looking now, but we're hoping we'll have distribution.
Yes.
Some streaming service. I would like it to be on something like the BFI player
Yeah.
because I think it's
That's
in
the right home,
tune.
isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Mubi would be a nice place, but you can't approach Mubi. They only select what they feel like selecting.
Gotcha.
And I did meet up with their curation team at Telluride, but they hadn't seen the film, so it'd be nice because that's also global. But I think the BFI player is accessible
Yeah.
globally.
Yeah.
So I think that would be a good home for it. But yeah, that will be the intention, to because we want to get it in front of as many people as who want to see it. And
Of
I'm
course.
getting tweets of people saying, "How can I see this? How can I see this?"
Mm.
So a few more months, and then hopefully there'll be a delivery solution somewhere.
Cool. So, what's the best way people can keep abreast of the developments of the film? Let's talk about your website and your social media.
So the website is Moviola the Movie, and we're also on Twitter with the same handle, Moviola the Movie. And so those are the two best places to probably follow for updates. The website's got the little coda as well, the little video that of Walter's final cut of the film. And most of the time, it's me posting through the Twitter account updates as to where we're screening next. I also have an Instagram for. I mean, I had to set up a production company for this thing and do it properly.
Yeah.
So I've used my production company, the Curators. So
Hmm.
there's a Twitter account for that, and it's the Curators UK on Instagram because someone had nicked the Curators before I got there. But any of those routes, you'll find it and see us talking about the film. We're up for an Eddie Award, which is really
I
incredible.
read, yeah.
So that I was meant to be going tomorrow to Los Angeles. That's been cancelled. So I was going to be all packed with my suitcase sitting next to me today, but not anymore. But it's hopefully it's postponed, and I will
Yes.
be going. But we're nominated for best edited documentary feature at the Eddies this year. So
Awesome.
um, that would be lovely, just to be able to be at the event amongst a lot of other editors, because, like you said, it's a film tailor made for those people. So
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to the connections and meeting people for the first time who I've been speaking to, like you know, on Twitter for such a long time,
Yeah.
and getting to meet them in person.
Yeah, no, it's been great to talk to you, Aaron. I appreciate your time today, and I love the film, and I'm dying for everybody to see it so that we can talk about it some more. But and
Yeah.
you know, I've also loved watching you carve this trajectory for yourself with this film as well. It's been really great to watch. But yeah, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Jamie. Appreciate it.
That was Howard Berry talking about his film. Her name was Moviola. I hope you enjoyed our conversation. If you're into film history, editing, or just love hearing about the behind the scenes side of filmmaking, this is definitely one to check out. The film, as Howard said, is still on the festival circuit, but you can keep up with it at moviolathemovie.com and on Twitter at moviolathemovie. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends. Leave a review if you can, that would really help. Haven't had many this year so far, so it'd be really good if you could leave a review if you haven't done so already. Particularly you folks that have been listening for, you know, since the beginning, or at least maybe 50 episodes. Please just give something back. Just review it for me, or join the Patreon. Like I said, patreon.com/Jamie Benning. You can also follow me as Filmumentaries on Threads, Instagram, and Facebook. Always worth mentioning, my Jedi Timeline book that I did with Justin Berger is still available on Amazon. The Jedi Return of the Jedi, the Unauthorized Timeline. So look out for that. It's only 20 quid, and it's a good book if you love that kind of thing. Thanks to Mike Hewitt Brown from MB Music for the music for this podcast, as always. Saw Mike recently in my local park going for a walk. He had headphones on, was striding along. We just managed a quick fist bump, but it'd be good to catch up with you, Mike, at some point. Yeah, loads going on. Got some good guests coming up as well, actually. Lining up some interesting ones of people that don't always get to tell their story, and finding out some interesting little tidbits about their part of the industry, which, you know, is what this podcast is about. I love digging around and finding those stories. I think they're worth preserving, and that's what I want this to be, the podcast. I want it to be, you know, a repository of history stories. Another thing I should mention, my friend Rachel Finch, who I hung out with at Star Wars Celebration here in London in 2023, she is actually going to Japan for Star Wars Celebration Tokyo. I'm not going. I can't afford it. I haven't got the time or the money at the moment, but she has kindly offered to do some little reports for us about what it's like each day there. So while Rachel's out in Tokyo enjoying Star Wars Celebration, she's going to give us a little 5-minute snippet of what's gone on that day, and I'm going to put those as bonus episodes of the podcast for those of you that, you know, got here through the gateway drug of Star Wars. That's for you. It's for us. It's for me. And yeah, thanks to Rachel for offering that. Looking forward to hearing it, and hopefully we can even work out a time when we can actually speak about it, have a conversation about it. For now, though, thanks for joining me for this hour of film chat. And I hope you can do the same for the next episode of the Filmumentaries podcast.
Weirding Way Media.